this evening and open to the book of Acts, chapter number 9, and we will be there in just a moment. Running a little bit everywhere this evening, taking care of a couple things and some prayer requests that just came in, so we'll mention those to you in just a moment. But as you find your place in Romans chapter number 8, chapter number 9, we'll be in chapter 8 as well in just a moment. I want to give you a couple announcements, and then we'll go over the prayer requests at the end this evening. As far as by way of announcements, I want to thank everyone for your kindness to Mark and Katie McElreath on Sunday. They enjoyed being with us and commented several times about our church just being very friendly, very kind to them. So thank you for that, and did a wonderful job helping them off as they get started with the love offering. You know, it'd be a little bit, it's a little bit nerve-wracking, I think, when you start deputation and you start raising support to go as a church planner or a missionary, because as you start, you just have what you have personally. Until you get through those first few weeks of visiting churches, there's no monthly support. Now, luckily for Katie and Mark, they've been on the field before, so several of those churches had already taken them on, but I know it was a blessing to them to be able to help them sort of get started on their way. They're just getting started. They're going to travel for a couple months and then try to start meeting with their church in November there in Atlanta. I was able to be with Mark yesterday a little bit more. I spoke at a pastor's retreat or pastor's meeting yesterday, and it was a church planners meeting. I said, hey, Mark's a church planner. He had been up in Woodbridge Sunday night. Why don't you come down with me? And the other pastor was coming as well that he's with this evening, so got to hang out with him a little bit yesterday and introduce him to several pastors and some churches that are there, so hopefully they'll be well on their way very soon. I'm excited about the work that they're going to be doing in Atlanta, and hopefully we'll continue to pray and support them as well. And then I just want to take a moment and thank, we had several ladies and several people that helped yesterday. You had it there in your Sunday bulletin about prepping some meals for different families, different people in our church, and I just want to express thanks for those of you that came in and helped with that. It took a couple hours yesterday and prepared some different meals in bulk and delivered those to families that had been sick or had illness, some that had COVID, some that had some family hardship or lost loved one, or some that had some surgery, procedure. We just kind of have a lot of people that have been through things recently. So I think they took 10 or 12 meals to different places yesterday, and so I just want to express thanks for that. And everyone that we were able to do that for expressed their thanks and asked us to say thank you as well to those of you that helped with that. So we're excited that we were able to help in that way. All right, look at Romans chapter number 8 and 9. We're going to be there in just a moment. And if you would, we'll start in Romans chapter 9 and then walk our way through a good portion of this passage and then be in a couple others as well. The story that we are talking about tonight, I call it a story, or it's Paul's account or his own story of his conversion, his turn to the gospel. Luke is recording it here in Acts chapter number 9, but it is interesting and it is powerful. You know, as we've studied through the gospel storyline through the entire Bible, there's been some people that we have focused on, but for the most part it has been the big themes, the big works, the great things that God has done through people and through His Word and through His working through His people. We haven't really stopped and focused on a particular person, and particularly their conversion or their turning to the gospel. But I think it's important tonight, we're going to talk about the power of the gospel, but particularly in the life of Paul. Now, to save us all some confusion, I just referenced him as Paul throughout the entire lesson tonight. I understand that before he was converted, he was Saul, and after he was converted, the Lord called him Paul. But rather than me try to remember every instance in which I'm referring to him, and you remember every instance, we're just going to call him Paul tonight, because I think that when we get to heaven, that's what we're going to call him. That's what the Lord named him, and so we're going to reference him as Paul. But of course, before he comes to the gospel, he is known as Saul of Tarsus, and he was feared by the church. We'll talk about why in a moment. But I think it's important to look at this particular conversion as we look at the theme of the gospel. The last few weeks, we have talked about how the gospel spread, how God gave a mission to the church, and then the church acted on that mission, how God spread the gospel throughout, but then He also scattered the gospel around the world through some troublesome times for the church. The last lesson we talked about the great persecution that the church faced, but how ultimately it led to God working in His people to do his mission through the world anyway. We talked about the power of God and the power of the gospel through that. But we're going to look particularly at Saul becoming Paul in his salvation, not only because he wrote a good portion of the New Testament, not only because he was what some would say one of the first real active foreign missionaries of the church, really sent out with purpose to go to different places to plant churches, not only because he is one of the greatest, as we would call him, contributors to early Christendom as we can possibly find, but more than that, the great story of what he was converted out of and how that took place is going to be an important thing. That's what we want to look at this evening from Romans chapter 9, where Luke gives the account. But then it's interesting, I have said Romans about 10 times, Acts chapter number 9, so that I'm not confusing, Acts chapter number 9. But it's not only given this account in Acts number 9, it's also given in two other places by Paul himself. And it's interesting. In the gospel accounts, you get a little bit of that, where the feeding of the 5,000 is told from 3 or 4 different ways or 3 or 4 different stories. And you get that a little bit about some of the teachings of Jesus or the miracles of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus is told multiple times through multiple books. But rarely in a book is the same account or story or event mentioned or told multiple times. But in the book of Acts, the conversion of Paul is told in detail, in fact, in very similar detail, 3 different times. It's given twice by Paul himself as he preaches and gives his testimony, and it's given once by Luke in his narrative here in Acts chapter number 9. So I think if it mentions it 3 times, it should be important to us as we walk our way through. Look, if you would, in verse number 1. We'll read together and then talk about how this impacts us this evening. Verse number 1. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth, and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand, and brought him into Damascus. And he was there, and he was 3 days without sight, neither did he eat nor drink. There was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. And to him said the Lord in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Behold, I am here, Lord. And the Lord said unto him, Arise, and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he prayeth, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man, how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from chief priests to bind all that call on thy name. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. Let's ask the Lord to help us as we study this evening. Father, help us as we look to your word, as we seek in it for understanding and for answers, and that you guide and direct us as we apply this to our own lives. And we'll pray this in your precious name. Amen. Mentions there on your lesson sheet, and if you're here in person, of course you have one of those, and I'll mention for those that are traveling, watching online, you can go to our website and find the notes for tonight's lesson as well. Follow along with us. But you see there in your notes it says, in our last lesson we examined the spread of the gospel. And I want you to think about this. One evidence that is often listed for the truth of the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that, of the relentless commitment of Christ's followers in the days and the months after his ascension. By the time we get to Acts chapter 9, about 3 years most likely has expired since Jesus ascended into heaven. So you have about 3 years of the early church, and I'm sure it went very quickly. But one of the main support behind, well, did Jesus really raise from the dead? One thing you'll often hear listed is how passionate his apostles and disciples were, the ones that said they had seen him raised from the dead and seen him ascend into heaven. Why would they ever lie about that and hold so truth if they were going to suffer so greatly for it? Why would you die for something that you had completely made up? And so several of the disciples, Stephen has already been martyred, and they've been spread throughout. They're suffering persecution. They're running for their lives. They're giving up their livelihoods, all because they know the truth of the resurrection of Christ and the power of the gospel. But we see that great power maybe best displayed in the book of Acts in the conversion of this one Saul into Paul. We have it mentioned here. It says Acts 1 through 9 covers about 3 years. And during that time, thousands of people were converted. God began to establish his church throughout the world. I want you to think about this. Many other religions have been established throughout history by a variety of means. And I'm lumping Christianity in there for a moment just for comparison's sake. How were they established? Well, some of them established by violence or by war or by commandeering certain properties and lands and then expanding a thought process or a kingdom. Some of it by influence, some of it by authority, some by schemes and tricks and different ways that they convince, and many just simply over a vast amount of time a religion developed. Once it went for hundreds of years and some even thousands of years. Eventually there's enough adherents and it's far enough from its origin. Very rarely, actually, you can't find any time where any religion spread as quickly and as powerfully as in the early church and in Christianity. Why would that be true? Because the gospel is the truth. Because the gospel is powerful. Notice, it says Christianity is different from these. It didn't spread by battle or by war. It did not reward its followers with influence or riches like some religions had before and have since. It didn't take centuries for the church to gain followers or adherents. It spread by the power of God in his Spirit through the gospel. Notice this, it did not conquer lands or kingdoms or cities. It was not that Christianity, the Christians went in by force and took over a city. Saul is traveling to Damascus to bring out the Christians. The Christians had not gone into Damascus and taken Damascus over. The gospel had taken the people over that were in Damascus. So you see how it phrases there. One amazing thing about the gospel is it does not seek to crush its enemies. It seeks to win them by inviting them to come. And so this element of the gospel may best be seen in the life of Saul. That's what we're going to talk about tonight, or the life of Paul. What other religion takes its most hideous and horrendous, vilest enemies and does not seek to conquer them physically, but seeks to conquer their hearts? Does not seek to take them over and rid themselves of them, but seeks to gain them and bring them into their own faith. And we're going to see that in the life of Paul. I want you to notice a few things tonight. Number one, we're going to look at the condition of Paul's heart. We talked a moment ago about that new wave of Christianity as it went. Well, that began to attract attention, particularly to a lot of the religious Jewish rulers, and particularly Saul, or who would become Paul. We have already read a few weeks ago about how he had a part in Stephen's death. They laid their coats at his feet. And in fact, it goes on in chapter number 8. Look there, if you would, verse number 1. Talking about Stephen, it says, "And Saul was consenting unto his death." So Saul did not just watch, he was a part of it. He was supportive of it. He was for it. And then you just go one chapter later in chapter number 9 and verse number 1, and now you have Saul not just consenting in their deaths, but active in their deaths, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. Notice it doesn't say he threatened to slaughter. He carried out by threatening and by slaughtering. He was murdering people within the church. And not just in Jerusalem, where there was some great revival of the Jewish people's hearts, not just where it made the religious people angry. They weren't just pushing them out of Jerusalem. They weren't just getting them out of their homes. Stay away from us. you're fine as long as you don't come near us. Notice, if you would, these first couple verses again. It says in verse number 2, desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they be men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. So they start persecuting the church. The church leaves Jerusalem. And it didn't end there. It wasn't just enough that the church left. They were so passionate, and people like Paul were so passionately angry and hateful toward the church that it was not enough that they just went away. He went after them. Anybody know where Damascus is? Damascus is in the country of Syria. It wasn't like he was going to the next neighborhood over to chase down what Christians had escaped. He is going across the land, across a country, with written orders in his hand to go to the Jewish synagogue that was in Damascus and find anyone that believed in Jesus Christ and return them to Jerusalem for imprisonment and even death. This is the one that is about to be converted. Many people have preached messages or titled it this way, that he went from being a terrorist to an apostle. And that is literally what he was. He saw their religion, he saw their faith, he saw their belief in the gospel, he hated it, so he went to the appropriate authorities and he sought to remove them, bind them, imprison them, and kill them. He struck fear in the hearts of the church physically. This is the one. So let's look first at the condition of Paul's heart. Notice we mentioned it a moment ago. It's what we've been talking about. He was a violent, active enemy of the gospel. He was not just an enemy of the gospel. He was not a passive enemy of the gospel. He was active against the gospel. He was going out searching for them. We read each of these verses that you have mentioned in chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. But look over, or I'll put it on the screen, I think, for you this evening. Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. By his own testimony. Here's Paul's own testimony. For ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted, the word wasted there means, and destroyed it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals, in other words, the same age and same status, in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the tradition of my fathers. He was as passionately Jewish as he could be, which meant he was as passionately against Christendom and the church as he could be. And he, in his own words, I persecuted the church to destroy it. He was violent and he was active. That's the man that's about to be converted. Paul was a religious bigot convinced of the superiority of his own opinion and views. Look at Acts chapter 22, verses 3 and 4. We'll put up, it says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. So he's saying, I was brought up in the Jewish faith. I know the law. I was taught by respected religious leaders and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. Notice this, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. This is Paul's own testimony a little later. He says, here's the type of person I was. I was extremely religious. I was extremely bigoted in the sense that I thought everyone else was wrong, so much so that I sought to persecute even to the place of death. This is how passionate he was about what he believed. So not only was he just active against the gospel, he was so passionate about what his thought and belief was that you would have never thought this man is going to convert to the gospel. He's so passionate about what he believes, he is willing to kill Christians because they oppose his view. We have heard of people like that throughout history. There are people like that even alive today that are not only just against Christianity, but are so founded in their own belief of one thing or another, whether it's a faith, a religion, an opinion, a mindset, or something that they have, a worldview or a thought process that they have. They're so entrenched in it that not only do they hate the church and hate Christianity, but they're so entrenched that they think all else beside what they believe should die or should perish or should come upon hardship. I want you to notice, if you would, look at Galatians chapter 1, verse number 14. If you would there, Galatians chapter 1, verse number 14. Actually, I put it up a moment ago. I can put it back up again. Galatians chapter 1, verse 14. Notice this, exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. He says, I was so religious, super religious. entrenched in my own faith and belief. Then notice number 3, regardless of his intentions, is how we put it. Paul was a wicked and sinful man. Look at Acts chapter 9, verse number 4. He says, he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, and notice the words of the Lord to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? You have to be a pretty bad person if the Lord comes to you and says to you, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting the God of the universe? Look at these two verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9. Again, Paul's testimony. We're using a lot of Paul's own testimony to describe himself this evening. For I am the least of the apostles, that am not meet to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. I mean, just say it that way. He persecuted the church of God. He's a sinful man. Notice 1 Timothy 1:15. This is a faithful saying, worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. Here's Paul's testimony, of whom I am chief. So think about those three thoughts again. He is a violent, active enemy of the church. He is rooted and entrenched in his own religious views and beliefs, so much so that he wants to eradicate all others. And at the root of all of this, he is just a wicked and sinful man. And he's a candidate for the gospel. I want you to think about that for a moment. I don't know if you know anybody personally that fits all three of these descriptions. You may know somebody, maybe not personally, but you may know someone historically. Someone may come to your mind that you may have heard about or read about at some point. This is as vile of a person. This is we mentioned a moment ago, a terrorist of the church. And yet he is about to be gloriously saved by the gospel of Christ. So I want you to think, you may not find anybody that fits all three of these descriptions, but what about even just one of them? And I want you to apply this and think about it for a moment. There's some introspective questions there at the bottom. I want you to think about this. What type of person do we typically think is a good candidate for the gospel or Christianity? Tell you what, you hear sometimes. This person, I have a neighbor, and they are just a kind, they're not saved, but they are just a kind, gentle person. If they would just be saved, I just know that they could believe in the gospel. I know that they could come to Christ. They are just a wonderful, wonderful person. That's sometimes what we may hear. They're right on the brink of trusting in the Lord, or they have a background somewhat. Their parents went to church, or when they were young, they were part of the faith, but they've gone away from it a little bit, but I think that they would come back. We may think that that's a good candidate for Christianity. We'll talk about it in a moment. The point is that everyone is a good candidate for Christianity, but you don't typically think of this. You don't think of the worst terrorist in the world. You don't think of America's most wanted. You don't think of someone that is sitting in prison for egregious crimes. But that is exactly what Paul was. What do you think of when you think of, I say somebody's a good candidate for the gospel? What type of person? Ask yourself this question. If you can't answer that one, what type of person do we typically assume, notice this, may be beyond the reach of the gospel? Have you ever felt that way about somebody? I know I have. I know I have recently had to catch my own mind and my own heart and my own thoughts when I just think that's never going to connect for them. It's never going to happen. I know this person. I have heard this person. I've heard the way they talk. I've heard the things they talk about. I've heard their heart. I've heard their mind. They have talked to me about this or that, or I've heard of this person. I've read of their sins. They are wicked. It's never going to happen. Let me tell you tonight, Paul was that person. Can you imagine the early church? The early church knew of him. Notice in verses 13 and 14 what Ananias says. Lord, I've heard by many of this man how he has done evil things in Jerusalem. But then notice, they knew he was coming. Verse 14, and here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on thy name. He hadn't even gotten to Damascus yet. But Ananias knows that he's coming. That's how awful of a person he was. The whole church, in fear, knew this man was coming to destroy and to kill them. He was a terrorist. He was a criminal. He is a sinner. Notice this, Paul was classic too far gone personality. He was dogmatically convinced that he was right. He was just as convinced that Christians were wrong and dangerous. He hated Christianity. He had no idea that he was lost. He had power and influence and seemed to be enjoying his life. He was not searching for anything. He does not fit the description of anyone that would walk through the door of our church on a Sunday morning to visit. He doesn't fit the description of anyone who you may see going down the road and think, You know what? That person looks like they need to. He didn't even fit the type of description where you say, that person looks sad. They look like they are searching. They're heartbroken and they need to hear the gospel. He doesn't even fit that description. He is confident. He is bold. He is brash. He has no questions for anyone. He wants to seek. He wants to destroy. He is convinced of what he believes. He has need of nothing. He is the exact opposite of everything we think about when we think of someone that might trust the gospel. Notice, if we think about this, I left you some space there. How should this change our hearts and our thoughts about who we give the gospel to, or about who needs the gospel, or about who the gospel can affect? As Christians, we have this mindset. And I'm speaking to you frankly this evening because I've had to speak to myself frankly. There are people in your mind and in your heart, just as there are people in my mind and my heart, that I think will never, ever be saved. We do. We think that. Because we don't think about sometimes what the Bible teaches the life of a person like Paul. Let's notice that. We've noticed the status or what his heart was like, but then notice this, the conversion of his heart. And I want you to notice a few things about it. Looking again in Acts chapter 9, and then we're going to look, if you got a couple fingers, you can stick in Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter 26 as well. We're going to look at Paul's account of his own salvation as well as Luke's. But look at Acts chapter number 9, if you would, for a moment. Look at verse number 3. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. He says the same thing in Acts chapter 22. He says the same thing in Acts chapter 26. We'll read it in a moment. But now I want you to notice this. The change in Paul's mind and heart and life was so amazingly quick. It couldn't have been anything but the Lord. It was not that he softened his heart over time. It is not that some little child came to him and put a thought in his heart and then he was restless. It's not that he went in and he took a mom and dad away from children and persecuted them and imprisoned them or killed them, and so it plagued his mind with guilt as he thought about those houses and those homes that he had ruined, and he laid at night restless and the guilt was all over him, and eventually he came to saving faith. No, he was completely fine with his sin, and in a moment the Lord changed his heart. In an instant, the Holy Spirit works in him. Again, quite the opposite of what we may normally think. Notice the second thing. Not only was it sudden, but it was unexpected by everyone. But then notice we put this, but planned by God. We've already read Acts chapter 9, verses 10 through 16, where Ananias is shocked, surprised. But the Lord says, I have chosen him for a purpose. Look at Acts chapter 22. Look at verses 6 through 11 of Acts chapter 22. It says, and it came to pass that as I made my journey, Paul's words here, and was come nigh unto Damascus, he even gives the details, about noon. Suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell into the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And verse 10, and I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all the things which are, notice this, appointed for thee to do. This is part of God's plan. Look at Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. He says, you're going to do things that I've appointed for you to do. Notice how he phrases it in chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. He says, Whereupon I went to Damascus with authority and a commission from the chief priest. It says again, At midday or at noon, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me, and them which journeyed with me. And when they were fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I said, Who art thou, Lord? And notice what he says. And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. But rise, stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness, both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles unto whom now I send thee, to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light. That's what he's saying. And from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. What is Paul saying? God planned this. He knew right where Saul was on the road to Damascus. He knew right what he needed. God knew exactly what he needed to be converted and to be saved. The power of the Holy Spirit had chosen Paul aside from everyone else that we have discussed, from all the other people that may have been good. Why didn't he pick Ananias? Why didn't he do it this way for Barnabas? Because he had chosen Paul for this purpose. What do we see? That his conversion was unexpected by everyone else, but planned by the Lord. I want you to notice, of course, we just read all three testimonies. What do we learn from it? It was God's doing and God's planning. How do we know that? Paul was not seeking Jesus. And we're not told anywhere that anyone was trying to lead him to Jesus. I'm sure the church wished that he would come to Jesus, but we're not told of any effort that anybody made to go tell Paul of the gospel. So what do we have? God himself does the work. Does that mean we should never go tell someone about the gospel? Of course not. We should go tell people about the gospel. That may be the avenue or the means by which God chooses to save someone. But it does show us that it is not up to just our efforts by which people are saved. It is the Lord. It is what God does. It is by God's Spirit. Notice the second thing. It was directed specifically at Paul. It wasn't just, well, whoever sees this light, you can get saved. You should follow me. You'll be this great apostle. You will write most of the New Testament. Remember, it says there's other people with Paul. Well, who was with him? Other people going to imprison the church. Other people who were just like him. But out of all of it, he speaks Saul, Saul. He says it to his name. And Paul says other people around him fell down. They saw, they heard, they were going through the same things that he was, but they did not hear the call that Saul did in the same way. Why is that? Because God had planned, because God had chosen Paul for this purpose. It was shocking to everyone involved. Think about this, including Saul. I can't imagine, and you sense it in Paul's writings later. You sense it in his writings in Galatians, in Ephesians, in 1 Timothy, the gratitude he expressed toward the gospel when he says, I do not deserve the gospel. I know what I was. I know I was wicked. I know I was the most vile you could possibly be. Why would God save me? Notice number 3, Paul's conversion had a specific purpose. We read that in each of those a moment ago. He says, which I have appointed unto him. I have chosen him for a purpose. I have sought him to see others saved. Don't you look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, if you would. 1 Timothy chapter 1, look at verse number 16. We'll see again Paul's own testimony. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse number 16. Notice this. Howbeit for this cause I obtained mercy. So for this purpose I obtained mercy. Why? That in me first Jesus Christ might show forth all longsuffering, for a pattern to them which should hereafter believe on him to life everlasting. Notice the phrase there. Here's why I received mercy, is what Paul says. I understand the purpose that God extended mercy to me, not because I was great, not because I deserved, not because I had tried to obey the law, but so that God could prove to everyone, if he would save me first, anyone else that hears my testimony would surely know they can be saved as well. I want you to think about this. The details that Paul gives in his account or in his testimony in Acts chapter 22 and chapter 26, how do you think Luke knew those details? Because Paul told those details. Because he talked to people about it. In Acts 22, he's talking to these religious rulers. In Acts chapter 26, he's speaking to a king. He's speaking to the pagan king. He would tell anyone that would listen, so much so that Luke knew the exact details because he had heard it over and over, most likely, as he traveled with Paul. He had heard his testimony constantly. Why? Because Paul understood, I have not just been saved so that I could stay out of hell. I have not just been saved so I can go to heaven. I have not just been saved for myself. I have been saved to be a testimony to all others that they can be saved as well. So we saw first the condition of Paul's heart, but then the conversion was miraculous. I want you to think about these introspective questions, if you would. What does your heart normally feel, or what do you normally feel about or do when someone that is lost shows no interest in following Jesus? How do we treat them? How do you treat people that you do not expect will become Christians? When someone that is previously very bad is actually saved, what limitations do we put on their spiritual life in your own mind because of their past? And then very bluntly, who deserves to be saved? And who is qualified to serve God? Think about those for a moment. What does your heart normally do when there's someone that has no interest in the things of God? What is your natural response to that? To leave them alone? To close off to them the way that they've closed off to us? To not speak to them about it so that we don't bother them? To be upset, to be angry, to be mad at them because that was their choice toward us? How do you treat someone that you have no expectation that they'll ever trust the gospel? They're as bad as can be. They have hurt you. Maybe it's somebody that you have a relationship with, a family member, or someone that seems to have even maybe known things about God but completely rebelled against Him. How do we treat those people? Ananias, we don't have time tonight to study, but Ananias gives us a great example. The Lord says, go, show mercy to him, bring him in, treat him, talk to him, feed him, supply for him, treat him with kindness. And Ananias says, I don't know what in the world you're doing, but I will do it. And it changed the way that everyone else looked at Saul or Paul. I don't know if Paul would have ever been able to have the type of influence that he did had Ananias not been one of the first to treat him in that way with mercy and kindness. And then think about this question. Paul, the one that wrote most of the New Testament, the one that is the great missionary, the great apostle, he was previously, we've looked at these 2 points, he was a very bad dude. And then he became a very great servant of Jesus. I wonder today if someone as bad as Paul or as bad as Saul came into our church and was saved, would we ever give him the opportunity that was given to Paul? Would we ever allow ourselves to have the relationship with him that others then had with him? Would he ever be able to have the influence that he had in the early church? Or would he always be to us the really bad dude that happened to get saved? Past sins do not limit present service. They just don't. You never see that in the gospel. And so it's an example for us. Why is it that Saul's conversion, why is it that his testimony is given so many times? Why is it that he says it so often as he writes in the New Testament? Because he's giving us a pattern that really bad people can become really great servants for God through the power of the gospel. But we don't think that. We think the best candidates for the best service are the people that grown up in church, or they're the most studied, or the most well-read in the things of Christendom. They have the best testimony. They have the best story. God tells us quite the opposite. To him, the best story was this evil, wicked man that is radically changed by the power of the gospel. So let's ask ourselves those questions tonight, honestly, frankly. How do we treat people that we don't expect will become Christians? And if they ever do, how do we treat them afterwards? And then very simply, who deserves to be saved? No one. If you'll be honest, you'll admit that too. You do not deserve to be saved by the gospel of Christ. And so if no one deserves to be saved, who qualifies to serve God? If I don't deserve to be saved, then I certainly don't qualify to serve God. So the answer is, who deserves to be saved? No one. Who qualifies to serve God or serve God well? No one. But through the gospel, who can be saved? Everyone. And through the gospel, who can serve? Everyone. You think that even maybe of your own self at times. I do that often at different points in my life. I think back, I hear a lot of things from a lot of people, and I know that in my heart, a very wrong and sinful and wicked person, and it shocks me at times to think that God may even allow me halfway to ever be used for Him, and there is shame and there is guilt. How many things have we limited ourselves in because we don't think we qualify to serve God in a certain way? Well, you don't qualify. You don't deserve to be saved, so you obviously don't qualify. But you can be saved, and so now you can qualify to serve the Lord. It's the testimony of Paul. Notice the last thing. Very simply, lessons from Paul's life. I want you to notice these tonight as we finish. The power of the gospel is God's, not man's. It's His purpose, His way, and His plan. Obviously, this should be obvious to us as we've walked through the Old Testament and seen very wicked people be used by God for very great things just over and over and over. Even something like the tragic murder of Christ on the cross was used in His resurrection to empower all people to die through Him but be raised through Him to new life. That's the story of the gospel. So why would it ever surprise us that He worked in someone's life like Paul? The power of the gospel is not ours, it is God's. Conversion is a miracle that depends on God alone. I've thought a lot about that in the last few weeks and months. And how do we see people saved? How can I personally see more people saved? How do we see people saved in our church, and through our testimony? Our effort, sure, is important. God is calling us to go. He is calling us to tell. He is calling us, like Paul, to tell our story so often that all those around us know the power of the gospel in our life. He has called us to do all of those things, but it is only through His power that anyone is ever saved. So we must go to Him in prayer and in dependence. Notice number 3, no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. We have really hammered that a number of times this evening, but I want to hit it one more time before we leave. No one is beyond God's reach. No one's beyond His grace. Who is the person in your mind that you just assume won't ever be saved, that won't ever turn to the Lord? From the testimony of Paul tonight, we know no one is beyond God's grace. And then notice number 4, we've hit this as well. Maybe I got ahead of myself. Even the worst sinners can become the best servants of God, because past sin does not limit present service through the gospel. And then finally, the gospel gives purpose to every life. Paul was that candidate to be saved, but then put on a shelf by the church. He was the perfect, supreme candidate for, you're just lucky that God saved you to begin with, so sit over here and be quiet and watch us serve the Lord. That's exactly the way that maybe we would treat him, or the church would treat him at different points throughout history. But here in the early church, he radically is changed, and so others are radically changed by and through him. Let me just emphasize this as we finish tonight. No one gets into heaven by the skin of their teeth. No one barely gets in. We all fully get in. Anyone that goes, completely goes. No one scraps, no one fights, no one clings, no one barely makes it before the door shuts. God, through the gospel, blasts the way open through sin, and all that enter can do so confidently. So let's remember tonight, as we go back out into our world, and those people that we just don't think could ever be saved, that person that maybe you've tried to witness to and you've been so defeated by their attitude toward the things of the Lord. It can happen suddenly, it can happen quickly, it can happen radically, but it happens by the Lord's power. And when they are saved, may we rejoice that they have joined with us, and we call them and disciple them and serve alongside them as well. Lord, thank you for this story that we have in this account of Acts, and by Luke's account and by Paul's own account. He says, I'm going to give you my testimony. I'm going to give you my story. And he tells us of a really bad person that was saved by a really great Savior. And may we view ourselves that way, and may we view all those that we come in contact with. Everyone can be saved. No one is outside the reach of grace. No one barely gets in. You radically save and you completely save. And so may we trust the power of the gospel this evening. And we'll praise you for it in your precious name. Amen. We have 4 or 5 minutes as we conclude tonight. And